The funny thing about being underestimated is that people stop paying attention right before they lose everything. That thought crossed my mind as I stood in the middle of my parents' backyard, surrounded by string lights, polished wooden tables, and nearly 50 relatives gathered to celebrate my parents' 25th wedding anniversary. The summer air was warm, the smell of grilled steak drifted across the lawn, and laughter echoed from every corner of the party. On the surface, it looked like a perfect family celebration. But if you listened carefully, there was always one voice that seemed determined to remind everyone where I supposedly stood in the family hierarchy. That voice belonged to my brother-in-law, Ethan Brooks. Ethan loved an audience almost as much as he loved talking about himself. He arrived in a brand-new luxury SUV, made sure everyone noticed the keys, and spent the first hour discussing business deals, executive meetings, and how difficult it was to manage a company worth millions of dollars. Every story somehow ended with him being the smartest person in the room. I had heard the performance before. Most of us had. Still, nobody challenged him because it was easier to smile and nod than start an argument during a family event. I stayed quiet, helping my mother arrange desserts and refill drinks. That was another thing Ethan never understood. Silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it means someone has nothing to prove. As the evening went on, family members gathered around the patio while my father thanked everyone for coming. Glasses were raised. Photos were taken. Then Ethan stood up with a grin that instantly made my stomach tighten. I knew that expression. It was the same one he wore every time he wanted attention. Before we finished the toast, he said loudly, "I think we should recognize the real success stories in this family." A few people chuckled. Ethan began pointing around the table, praising relatives for promotions, businesses, and investments. Then his eyes landed on me. "And then there's Olivia." More laughter followed. My sister shifted uncomfortably beside him, but Ethan kept going. "You know, every family needs one person to remind us what happens when ambition takes a vacation." Several guests looked away. Others forced awkward smiles. Ethan raised his glass. "To Olivia, proof that not everyone is cut out for success." The words hung in the air. For a moment, the entire party became quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes watching me, waiting for a reaction. Ethan expected embarrassment, maybe even tears. Instead, I smiled politely and took a sip of sparkling water. That seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. "Come on," he said. "You have to admit it's funny." I simply nodded. "If you think so." He laughed, believing he had won. What Ethan did not know was that less than 12 hours earlier, I had signed the most important agreement of my life. A confidential transaction. A deal so significant that I was legally prohibited from discussing it for 72 hours. So while my brother-in-law stood in front of everyone calling me the failure of the family, I carried a secret that would soon change his entire world. And the most satisfying part was knowing he was still smiling. The party slowly recovered from the awkward moment, but the atmosphere never fully returned to normal. People went back to their conversations, yet I noticed more than a few relatives stealing glances in my direction. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked curious. A few probably wondered why I had not defended myself. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed energized by the attention. The more people listened to him, the louder he became. Within minutes, he was back to talking about quarterly profits, expansion plans, and the pressures of leadership. If someone had walked into the backyard without knowing our family, they would have assumed he owned half the state. I spent the rest of the evening helping clean dishes and checking on my parents. My mother quietly squeezed my hand while nobody was looking. She did not mention Ethan directly. She did not need to. After all these years, she knew exactly what had happened. "Thank you for helping tonight," she said softly. "You always make things easier." I smiled. That is what family does. Her expression lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say more, but guests were already calling her name. Across the yard, Ethan was surrounded by relatives again. I overheard him describing a new office renovation that supposedly cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every sentence sounded designed to impress. Every story placed him at the center of success. What fascinated me was not his confidence. It was how desperately he seemed to need validation. Around 9:30, my sister Lauren approached me near the dessert table. She looked uncomfortable. "I am sorry about Ethan," she said. "You know how he gets." I gave her a reassuring smile. "It is fine." "No, it is not." She lowered her voice. Sometimes I wish he would stop trying so hard to prove something. That comment stayed with me. Because deep down, I suspected Ethan was proving something to himself more than anyone else. Before I could respond, his voice echoed across the patio again. Olivia, come over here for a second. Several people turned toward us. I already knew this was another performance. Ethan grinned as I walked over. Tell everyone what you have been working on lately. A few relatives waited expectantly. I could have answered honestly. I could have told them exactly where I had been that morning. I could have explained why my phone had been buzzing all day with messages from attorneys and financial advisors. But confidentiality agreements existed for a reason, so I simply shrugged. Nothing too exciting. Ethan laughed loudly. See? That is the difference between us. In business, if you are doing something important, people know about it. More laughter followed. I noticed a few family members forcing smiles again. Ethan interpreted their discomfort as support. The truth was that nobody wanted confrontation at my parents' celebration. He mistook politeness for agreement. By the time I left the party around 10:30, Ethan was still entertaining his audience. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, my phone lit up with a new email. It came from one of the attorneys involved in the transaction. The subject line contained only 3 words: final approval received. I pulled into my driveway, read the message carefully, and allowed myself a small smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. In less than 3 days, a secret that had taken months to build would become impossible to hide. And when that happened, the person who had spent the evening measuring everyone else's worth was about to discover that he had completely misjudged mine. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and poured myself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. For months, every step of the transaction had required patience, discretion, and more self-control than most people realized. There had been conference calls that stretched late into the night, legal reviews that filled hundreds of pages, and negotiations that could have fallen apart with a single careless mistake. Yet throughout that entire process, not once had I felt as exhausted as I did listening to Ethan talk about success, as if he were the only person who understood it. By 8 o'clock, my inbox was already filling with updates. Attorneys, consultants, and financial advisors were all moving toward the same deadline. The 72-hour confidentiality period was still active, but everyone involved knew the public announcement was approaching. As I reviewed documents from my home office, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. Surprisingly, it was from Ethan. I almost laughed when I opened it. He was inviting me to lunch. Ethan rarely invited me anywhere unless there was an audience. Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. We met at an upscale restaurant downtown that overlooked the river. Ethan arrived 10 minutes late, wearing an expensive suit and carrying the same confidence he brought everywhere else. He immediately launched into a discussion about business, new contracts, future growth, expansion opportunities. For nearly 20 minutes, he talked without asking me a single question. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. You know, Olivia, I have always wondered why you never aimed higher. I stirred my iced tea and waited. What do you mean? He shrugged. You are smart enough. You just never seem interested in building anything big. I found that statement almost amusing. Ethan believed success only counted when people could see it. He measured achievement through headlines, luxury vehicles, and office buildings. The idea that someone could quietly build influence without broadcasting every move seemed completely foreign to him. Everyone defines success differently, I replied. He smiled politely, but his expression suggested he disagreed. Maybe, but results speak for themselves. A few minutes later, his phone rang. The moment he saw the caller identification, his confidence shifted. It was subtle, but I noticed it. He excused himself and stepped away from the table. Through the restaurant window, I watched him pacing outside while speaking rapidly. His relaxed posture disappeared. When he returned several minutes later, he forced a smile. Everything okay? I asked. Of course. The answer came too quickly. Ethan immediately changed the subject. The rest of lunch felt different. His attention drifted. His responses became shorter. Whatever had happened during that call was clearly bothering him. When we finally stood to leave, he shook my hand and thanked me for coming. As he walked toward the parking garage, I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly. That evening, one of my advisors called with an update. During our conversation, a detail caught my attention. Several senior executives inside Ethan's company had recently begun updating their employment agreements. That usually happened when leadership changes were expected. I ended the call and stared out the window for a long moment. The countdown was accelerating. Ethan still believed he understood everything happening around him. In reality, the ground beneath his feet had already begun to move, and he had no idea how close he was to discovering the truth. That night, I found myself thinking about something I had not revisited in years. Most people in my family believed Ethan had built everything on his own. They saw the successful executive, the polished presentations, the confident interviews, and the expensive lifestyle. What they never saw was the version of Ethan from 15 years earlier. Back then, he was not the man standing in front of relatives giving speeches about achievement. He was a young entrepreneur with a struggling business, mounting bills, and a future that looked increasingly uncertain. I remembered the afternoon he showed up at my apartment carrying a folder filled with financial statements. He looked exhausted. His company had lost several major clients. Cash flow was drying up, and investors were refusing to return his calls. At the time, nobody in the family knew how serious the situation had become. Ethan certainly did not want them to know. We sat at my small kitchen table for nearly 3 hours while he explained every detail. For the first time, the confidence disappeared, and I saw genuine fear. He was convinced everything he had worked for was about to collapse. I listened carefully and asked questions. When he finally finished, I gave him advice that helped him restructure several parts of the business. More importantly, I connected him with someone who later became one of his most valuable financial partners. That introduction changed everything. Within 2 years, his company stabilized. Within 5 years, it was growing rapidly. Over time, the crisis faded into memory. The success remained. Eventually, Ethan stopped talking about those difficult days altogether. The story became simpler. In his version, he had succeeded through sheer determination and talent. Everyone loves a clean success story. Few people want to hear about the people who quietly helped along the way. I never corrected him. I never asked for recognition. Frankly, I did not care. But as the years passed, something changed. Gratitude slowly transformed into arrogance. The more successful Ethan became, the more he began treating achievement as proof of personal worth. People who earned less were somehow less impressive. People who lived differently were somehow less ambitious. Somewhere along the line, he started measuring human value through income statements and job titles. The irony was that many of the strongest people I knew had nothing to prove to anyone. The next afternoon, Lauren called me unexpectedly. Her voice sounded tired. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally sighed. Something is wrong with Ethan. I remained quiet. He has been distracted for weeks, she continued. He barely sleeps. He keeps taking calls in private. Every time I ask what is happening, he says everything is under control. I looked out my office window toward the city skyline. Do you believe him? There was a long pause. No, she admitted. That answer told me more than she realized. Lauren knew Ethan better than anyone. If she was beginning to doubt him, the situation inside the company was probably more serious than most people understood. After we ended the call, I reviewed several reports that had arrived earlier that morning. The numbers confirmed what I already suspected. Important decisions were being made behind closed doors. Key stakeholders were preparing for a transition. Publicly, everything still appeared normal. Privately, a countdown had already begun. And with every passing hour, Ethan was moving closer to a moment he never saw coming. 2 days remained before the confidentiality period expired. By then, the pieces were moving faster than ever. Every morning brought new updates, and every update confirmed the same thing. The company Ethan believed he controlled was no longer operating according to his plans. The transition process had already begun behind the scenes. Most employees did not know it. Many managers only knew fragments. A handful of board members understood the full picture, and all of them were legally obligated to remain silent. What surprised me most was how normal Ethan continued to act in public. On social media, he posted photos from networking events and business lunches. He shared motivational quotes about leadership. He congratulated himself for achievements that looked impressive from the outside. Anyone reading those posts would have assumed he was standing on solid ground. The reality was very different. Late Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from one of the financial consultants involved in the acquisition. His tone was professional, but I could hear the significance behind every word. There has been another development, he said. 3 senior executives submitted notices this morning. I leaned back in my chair. Voluntary departures? Not exactly. More like precautionary positioning. That made sense. Experienced executives often recognized change before official announcements were made. They noticed unusual meetings, unexpected legal reviews, and shifts in decision-making authority. They could sense when a major transition was approaching. "How is Ethan responding?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "He is insisting everything remains under control." I almost smiled. That response sounded exactly like him. For years, confidence had been Ethan's solution to every problem. If circumstances became difficult, he projected more certainty. If pressure increased, he spoke louder. If doubts appeared, he dismissed them. The strategy worked surprisingly well until reality stopped cooperating. That evening, Lauren called again. This time she sounded genuinely worried. "He canceled dinner with friends for the third time this month," she said. "He keeps saying work is demanding more attention." I listened quietly. "Do you think he is hiding something?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. "I think he may be carrying more stress than he wants people to see." That answer was true without revealing anything confidential. Lauren sighed. "I barely recognize him lately." After the call ended, I found myself thinking about how differently people handle uncertainty. Some become more humble. Others become more defensive. Ethan belonged firmly in the second category. The following morning brought another interesting development. An official invitation was sent to several key stakeholders announcing a major board meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. Attendance was considered essential. I already knew about the meeting, of course. In fact, the date had been circled on my calendar for months. Still, seeing the invitation made everything feel more real. The countdown was no longer measured in weeks or days. It was measured in hours. Later that afternoon, I drove past Ethan's corporate headquarters on my way to another appointment. The glass building reflected the sunlight perfectly, projecting strength and success to everyone who passed by. Employees entered and exited through the front doors carrying laptops and coffee cups, completely unaware of what was coming. I glanced at the building for only a moment before continuing down the road. In less than 48 hours, the story Ethan had spent years telling the world about himself was going to collide with a truth he never imagined. And for the first time, he would not be the one controlling the narrative. Friday arrived with the strange calm that often comes before a major change. I woke up early, reviewed a few final documents, and confirmed the schedule for the afternoon. Months of preparation had led to this day. Every signature had been collected. Every approval had been secured. Every legal requirement had been satisfied. The confidentiality period was ending, and the final phase of the transition was about to begin. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I received a message from one of the board members. The meeting agenda had been distributed internally, and attendance was confirmed. Ethan would be there. Every director would be there. Senior executives would be there. Several outside advisors would be there as well. By the end of the meeting, nobody inside that room would be operating under assumptions anymore. They would be dealing with facts. Shortly before noon, Lauren called me again. Her voice carried a mixture of concern and frustration. "He barely spoke at breakfast," she said. "He keeps checking emails and taking calls." I listened quietly. "Maybe he is preparing for something important," I replied. "That is exactly what worries me," she said. "Whenever Ethan says everything is fine, it usually means everything is not fine." After we ended the call, I found myself reflecting on how different the next few hours would look depending on where someone was standing. For Ethan, it was a critical business meeting. For the board, it was a leadership transition. For investors, it was a financial event. For me, it was the conclusion of a long process that had required patience most people never saw. At 2 o'clock, I arrived near corporate headquarters and parked several blocks away. The meeting would not begin until 3, but I preferred having time to think. Through the windows of nearby buildings, I watched employees moving through their normal routines. Phones rang. Meetings started. Deliveries arrived. It looked like any ordinary Friday. Yet hidden beneath that routine was a reality very few people understood. Ownership had already changed. The paperwork was complete. The only thing remaining was the formal announcement. At 2:45, my phone buzzed with another message. It came from one of the attorneys. 3 simple words appeared on the screen. "Everything is ready." I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my phone and stepping out of the car. The afternoon air was warm. The city streets were busy. Nothing about the outside world suggested that a major corporate transition was taking place. Inside the building, however, tension was already building. Several executives had arrived early. Board members were gathering. Advisors were reviewing final materials. And somewhere inside that same building, Ethan was almost certainly preparing himself for what he believed would be another opportunity to demonstrate leadership. What he did not realize was that the assumptions guiding his confidence were about to disappear. As I entered the lobby, I noticed a digital display welcoming attendees to the board meeting. I stepped into the elevator and watched the floor numbers climb one by one. Months earlier, this moment had felt distant. Now it was finally here. In just a few minutes, the door to the conference room would open, and the first crack would appear in the version of reality Ethan had spent years believing was unshakable. The conference room was already nearly full when I arrived. Board members sat along one side of the polished table, while senior executives occupied the remaining seats. Large windows overlooked the city skyline, and the atmosphere carried the unmistakable tension of people waiting for important news. Conversations were polite but brief. Most attendees were watching the door, anticipating the arrival of the new controlling owner. Ethan stood near the head of the table, speaking confidently with several directors. At first glance, he appeared completely composed. His suit was immaculate. His posture projected authority. His voice carried the same certainty I had heard for years. Yet there were subtle signs that told a different story. He checked his phone repeatedly. He glanced toward the door every few minutes. And every time someone mentioned the acquisition, his smile seemed slightly forced. I remained outside the room for a few moments while final preparations were completed. One of the attorneys reviewed several documents with me and confirmed that everything was in order. Once the announcement began, there would be no confusion and no room for interpretation. Ownership records, voting rights, and board approvals were all finalized. The transaction was complete. At exactly 3 o'clock, the meeting was called to order. I listened from outside as the chairman welcomed everyone and thanked them for attending. He spoke about the company's history, its recent challenges, and the opportunities ahead. Then he addressed the subject everyone had been waiting for. Today, he said, we formally introduced the new controlling owner of the company. The room became completely silent. Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. He looked confident, almost excited. Like many others in the room, he expected a representative from a private equity firm or investment group. He was preparing to negotiate from a position he still believed he held. The chairman continued speaking for another minute before pausing. Then he turned toward the entrance. Please join us. That was my cue. I opened the door and stepped inside. For a second, nobody reacted. Several executives looked confused. A few board members exchanged knowing glances. Ethan stared at me as if he could not process what he was seeing. The silence stretched across the room. I walked calmly toward the table and took the seat reserved for the incoming owner. Only then did the reality begin to register. Ethan's expression changed first. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became shock. Olivia, he finally said. Nobody answered him immediately. The chairman simply slid a folder across the table. Inside were the official documents identifying the new ownership structure. Ethan opened the folder and stared at the pages. His eyes moved from one line to the next. Then he read them again. Around the room, several executives watched carefully. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The documents spoke for themselves. After nearly a minute, Ethan slowly looked up from the folder. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed completely unable to find the right words. The man who always had an answer for everything sat motionless in absolute silence, while an entire room watched his understanding of the situation change in real time. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than any speech that could have followed. Ethan continued staring at the documents in front of him, as if reading them a third or fourth time might somehow produce a different result. Around the table, several executives exchanged cautious glances. They had spent weeks hearing rumors and speculation, but now the uncertainty was gone. The facts were sitting directly in front of them. The chairman finally broke the silence. He calmly reviewed the transaction, explaining that the acquisition had been completed through a series of structured agreements approved by all required parties. Every regulatory requirement had been satisfied. Every legal review had been completed. There was no dispute and no ambiguity. The ownership transition was final. Ethan slowly placed the folder on the table. "I do not understand," he said. "How is this possible?" His voice no longer carried the confidence that had filled the room earlier. It sounded smaller, controlled, but uncertain. One of the attorneys answered professionally. "The transaction has been in progress for several months." Several months. The phrase seemed to hit him particularly hard. While he had been assuming he was negotiating with an anonymous investment group, the process had already been unfolding around him. He had simply failed to see it. Then came the second revelation. The chief financial officer distributed another set of documents. Unlike the first folder, these reports focused on obligations, liabilities, and financing arrangements connected to the company. As board members reviewed the material, the room became quiet again. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages. This time the surprise was even more visible. The acquisition was not the entire story. Through separate agreements connected to the transaction, substantial portions of the company's outstanding obligations had also been consolidated under the new ownership structure. The practical effect was simple. The authority guiding the company's future was now concentrated in one place. Several executives immediately understood the significance. They began asking thoughtful questions about long-term plans, operational stability, and employee retention. Their attention shifted away from the shock of the announcement and toward the future of the business. That was when I noticed something important. Nobody seemed angry. Nobody appeared panicked. In fact, many looked relieved. The uncertainty that had been hanging over the company for months was finally ending. The conversation gradually transformed from disbelief into cautious optimism. Ethan remained unusually quiet. For years, he had been the dominant voice in nearly every room he entered. Now he was listening while others discussed plans he had not anticipated. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Eventually, he looked directly at me. "Why?" he asked. The question contained no hostility, only confusion. I considered my answer carefully. "Because I believe the company deserved a future." Several people nodded. The response was simple, but it was true. This was never about humiliation. It was never about revenge. It was about stewardship, stability, and opportunity. The chairman then moved the meeting forward, outlining next steps and governance updates. One by one, executives began engaging with the new direction. The momentum inside the room had shifted completely. For the first time all afternoon, Ethan seemed to understand that the story was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. And as the meeting continued, the man who had spent years measuring others by titles, income, and appearances was forced to confront a reality he had never expected. The person he underestimated most had quietly become the most influential person in the room. The meeting ended nearly 2 hours later, but the moment everyone remembered was not the announcement itself. It was what happened afterward. As executives gathered their materials and slowly filed out of the conference room, Ethan remained seated. The confident executive who once dominated every conversation now looked like a man re-evaluating years of assumptions. One by one, board members approached me to discuss future plans. Department heads introduced ideas for improving operations. Advisors requested follow-up meetings. The company was already moving forward. Eventually, only a handful of people remained in the room. Ethan stood and walked toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows behind him, and the afternoon sunlight reflected across the conference table. Finally, he broke the silence. "Are you going to replace me?" It was an honest question. Not defensive, not angry, just honest. I looked at him for a few seconds before answering. "That depends." He nodded slowly. "On what?" "On whether you can lead with the same respect you expect from everyone else." His eyes dropped briefly toward the table. For the first time in years, there was no audience. No relatives. No executives to impress. No employees watching. Just two people having a conversation. "I was wrong about you," he admitted quietly. The words seemed difficult for him to say. Not just today. For a long time. I did not respond immediately. Some apologies arrived too late to erase what happened, but they can still reveal growth. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I spent years assuming I understood success." A faint smile crossed my face. "A lot of people do." He nodded again. "I thought I knew who mattered and who did not." The irony was obvious to both of us. The person he had publicly dismissed at my parents' anniversary celebration had been sitting across from him all along, building something far larger than he ever imagined. A few days later, my parents hosted a small family dinner. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. News of the acquisition had spread quickly. Some relatives were embarrassed by how they had treated me. Others suddenly seemed eager to start conversations. Human nature has a funny way of changing when new information appears. As everyone gathered around the table, Ethan stood up before dinner began. The room immediately became quiet. Several family members looked nervous, unsure what he might say. Ethan glanced around the room before speaking. "There is something I need to say." Nobody interrupted. "Last weekend, I made jokes that should never have been made. I judged someone based on assumptions instead of facts. More importantly, I judged someone based on status instead of character." His eyes met mine. "I owe Olivia an apology." The room remained silent. No dramatic reactions followed. No arguments. No speeches. Just a simple acknowledgement of the truth. I thanked him and accepted the apology. Then we sat down and shared dinner like a family should have done from the beginning. Later that evening, as I drove home beneath the fading orange glow of the sunset, I thought about everything that had happened. The acquisition had changed the company. It had changed Ethan. It had changed how others viewed me. But the biggest lesson had nothing to do with money, ownership, or influence. Real strength rarely announces itself. Real success does not require constant validation. And the people who appear quiet in the background are often carrying stories far greater than anyone realizes. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody bothered to notice until it was too late.